A reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. Brothers and sisters, I ask then, has God rejected his people? Of course not. For I too am a child of Israel, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Hence I ask, did they stumble so as to fall? Of course not. But through their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make them jealous. Now if their transgression is enrichment for the world, and if their diminished number is enrichment for the Gentiles, how much more their full number? I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you will not become wise in your own estimation. A hardening has come upon Israel in part, until the full number of the Gentiles comes in, and thus all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion. He will turn away godlessness from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. In respect to the gospel, they are enemies on your account, but in respect to election, they are beloved because of the patriarch. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. Verbum Domini. The Lord will not abandon his people. Blessed the man whom you instruct, O Lord, whom by your law you teach, giving him rest from evil days. The Lord will not abandon his people. For the Lord will not cast off his people, nor abandon his inheritance. But judgment shall again be with justice, and all the upright of heart shall follow it. The Lord will not abandon his people. Were not the Lord my help, my soul would soon dwell in the silent grave. When I say my foot is slipping, your mercy, O Lord, sustains me. The Lord will not abandon his people.
Blessed are you among women. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Lucam.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
On a Sabbath, Jesus went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were observing him carefully. He told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing the places of honor at the table. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host who invited both of you may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man," and then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so that when the host comes to you, he may say, "My friend, move up to a higher position." Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Verbum Domini.
Nos tibi Christe.
Today we extend birthday greetings to our organist Derek, a good friend of the friars, and he's a baby of the Vigil of All Saints. I won't say a Halloween baby, but a baby of the Vigil of All Saints. And I think it's fitting. You know, every day he's here and gives us a foretaste of what the saints must hear in heaven, the beautiful hymns of praise before the throne of God. So we thank Derek for his faithful service, and we wish him a happy birthday. I know he doesn't like listening to our homily, so he checks out while we're preaching up here. What could we say about the gospel passage today? Don't you know who I am? You know, that's not what Jesus tells us to say. But isn't that our tendency as human beings? Don't you know who I am? You know, the whole world is supposed to know me. But what does Jesus say? Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And so he challenges us and gives us an invitation to exercise the virtue of humility. Humility is one of those virtues, just even hearing the word, we internally cringe a little bit. And it's certainly something we don't like to pray for. If you've ever asked the Lord for an increase in the virtue of humility, let me assure you, he will answer your prayer. And it can be, sometimes you want to say, okay, Lord, I got it, back off a little. But what we can do, or what we ought to do, is seek to exercise the virtue of humility. And I'd simply like to look at St. Francis of Assisi as a model for how to exercise this virtue. He is known as one of the ways we look at him as the saint of humility, the humble, poor man of Assisi. St. Francis, in his youth and in the lineage of his father, at one point in his life wanted to be somebody. And through his conversion and following the Lord, he instead sought to be nobody. He was a member of the merchant class. He wasn't the nobility, but his father always wanted to be, you might say, if he could be, a member of the nobility. And so he wanted his son to be very wealthy, to share in his own wealth, and to become this great knight, and to basically associate with the noble class, even though they warred against them. The merchant class fought against the nobility at the time of Francis. A lot of times that was motivated by a jealousy. And what happened with St. Francis in his life, though, when he set that aside, that he sought rather to go down into the valley below Assisi. So he left this little village, this town, where everybody would have known him, and he went out into this wooded area where the lepers lived and where the beggars roamed the paths, and he sought to become one of them. And he took on the cloak of the beggar. That is what the Franciscan habit is today, the cloak of the beggar at the time of Francis. And he who despised the leper, we know from St. Francis in his own account, in his own words, he said how he would encounter a leper and he would basically yell that they were to go away, and they made him absolutely sick. And yet after his conversion, after early on in his following the Lord, he said what had been bitter to him became sweet. And so he loved the leper and walked among them to serve them and care for them. So he sought to, instead of being somebody, he sought to be nobody, the opposite trend of the world. Every one of us wants to be somebody, and we want to be known. And St. Francis sought rather to be unknown, and that no one would know him. And what happened in his life is exactly what Jesus says: the one who humbles himself will be exalted. St. Francis wanted to remain unknown to the world, and yet what happened? Everyone knows him, whether you're Catholic, not Catholic, whatever you are, even non-Christian. When people look at us and say, "What are you? Who are you?" Many times we can say, "Have you ever heard of St. Francis?" "Oh, yeah. Everybody always acknowledges that. They know who this man is. That's not what St. Francis did. He didn't get on TV. He didn't put up billboards. He didn't have Facebook. He wasn't out there advertising who he was. Rather, he sought to be unknown, and in doing so, the Lord made him known, because in St. Francis's seeking to be unknown and insignificant, the Lord could use him to make others come to know him, to know Christ. And isn't that what we say about St. Francis in his life? The man most like Christ who walked this earth. So when we look at this holy man, or when we look at any saint, they do remain invisible as they desired, because they attract us ultimately to Christ, a greater knowledge of the attributes of God, you might say. And so St. Francis, who wanted to be this great knight, someone who was known in his time, set that aside and went out purposefully seeking to be unknown. One of the things that we also know about him is that he wished to live under obedience, always surrendering his will to another. And this is what he would often ask. He wanted to put aside responsibility for this new movement, but he would often ask that another brother be placed over him, and he would be obedient to that brother. Isn't this so contrary to our human nature, especially as Americans? We all want to be in the driver's seat. We don't only want to direct our lives, but we want to direct the lives of everyone around us. We don't have to run the whole universe, but our own personal universe, we need to be in charge. And we see this in very subtle ways in ourselves. That do I ever put my will aside to do what my brother wants to do? Or do I ever surrender my desire at the moment to be attentive to, well, this is what my brother or sister or family member is interested in doing, I'll do that with them. Instead, we want it always done my way, according to my plan, and we start directing everyone else's lives. And it's not just, I'm not talking about being a control freak. I'm just talking about being self-willed. And most of us, I think any of you who are married would know this, sometimes the greatest peace that comes in your homes with your spouse and with your family is when we're able to say, you know what, it's not that important that my will be done right now. And I can surrender my plan, my desire for love of the other. And so this is, St. Francis recognized that this goes contrary to our nature. We always, especially I think as men, want to rise up, and he was there always wanting to surrender and put himself under at the service of another. One of our brothers asked me, in something that we discussed in formation, he said, well, Father, I'm not understanding. Are you telling me I'm supposed to be a doormat? And I said, no, quite the contrary. We're not supposed to be a doormat. No, that's not what humility means. Being a doormat means that there's something sick about us. We're not approaching this the right way. However, what we are to seek to do is willfully place ourselves at the feet of our brothers. And this was a confusing sort of discussion. That sounds like I'm supposed to be a doormat, but there's a difference between being walked over and, dare I say, laying ourselves down for someone to use us to be at the service of another. So that we choose to do that, and we knowingly do that, and make ourselves less than our brother. Not to be used, but to serve them. And this is what St. Francis was all about. Simply point out 4 or 5 points that we can look at ourselves on a day-to-day basis in today's world, and to check ourselves in the virtue of humility, or the exercise of humility. And the first thing I'd look at in this regard is the phrase, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So difficult for most of us to say. But to ask myself, can I say I'm sorry? And can I say it and mean it? Without justification, without qualification. This is an indicator of pride for the most part, but also an indicator for us in humility. Many times, again, in relationship between spouses, it's all we have to say. I'm sorry. And leave the but out of it. Okay? I'm sorry. That's a key indicator for whether we're able to exercise, how we're exercising this virtue. Another way that I think in today's world where we can look at the virtue of humility exercised in our life, or where we're struggling with it, is this preoccupation that we have with appearances. Let's just really be honest with one another. There's only about 10% of us, even maybe 5% of us in the world, who are suitable for TV or the movies. The rest of you belong on the radio. As they say, you have something about it. You look like you belong on the radio, or you have a radio face or something. I have a radio face. I'm right with all the rest of us, huh? Well, let's be honest about that. We all think that, we're supposed to be so. And we get caught up in this. And I have a personal hang-up with this. I'm not opposed at all to people caring for themselves and their good health. But I think sometimes we use that as a cover to make sure that we're looking right. And we want everybody to be noticing us, or that we feel comfortable and confident in ourselves. Read the biographies about St. Francis of Assisi. Look at some of the paintings where they say these are the most accurate depictions of St. Francis. St. Francis, in his time, was very a fun-loving person as a young person. They called him the life of the party. And he knew how to throw a party. He used his father's money well. But he would sing and play this little flute and kind of knew how to have a good time. But the biographers tell us that he wasn't the most attractive kid in Assisi. Now, in our heads, that's what we do. Look at the statues. If you didn't know anything about St. Francis, how would you depict him? He'd be about 6 foot tall. He'd have this, beautiful coiffed, or whatever you say, beard. The stigmata would just look pristine, And he'd hold the gospel and, be looking up like this and gazing at the cross. That's how the statues and holy cards depict him. St. Francis was short. And they said he had a rough beard. This is what I like to, that's what I take consolation in. I can hardly grow a beard. I'm like St. Francis, I mean, that's how we can feel at times. But what I would say for us in our own time, look at Mother Teresa. Let's push out a ways and imagine, 400 years from now, how they're going to depict Mother Teresa in holy cards and statues. Well, we have so many images of her, so they'll try to make it look just like her. But if we didn't have all that, how would Mother Teresa be depicted? She would be this most stunning, beautiful woman you've ever imagined. That missionary of charity habit flowing in the wind as she carries the poor, Mother Teresa, so this little diminutive person, those big hands, and just kind of, when you look at her, and everybody, what do we always say about her? Oh, so beautiful, so beautiful. Father Emmerich Vogt points this out. He met Mother Teresa. He said, "Do you ever see pictures of her feet? Her toes are always kind of curled over each other." He said this with great respect for her. He said those hands, he called them meat hooks. He said those big meat hooks. And he said this with great love for this woman. Not to diminish her, but he said this is what we get caught up with in our own worldly perspective of sanctity. We just recently watched a film at the Friary, a wonderful film, made Brother Leo weep and everything, but a touching film about a man who worked with children in the inner city. And during the credits, they showed pictures of the real man who this movie was based on. And Brother John Therese said, one of the brothers, I think Isaac, pointed out, well, it's certainly they didn't use the real guy in the film. They used somebody that looked a little bit better. Why? Because when we want to be inspired, you put this, this perfectly handsome person out there to do this, carry through this role. But when you saw the real guy, he was an average Joe. He looked just like you and me. And I think many times we can get caught up in that. But to move beyond that, I would say the other thing that that can often happen is this appearance of humility. Now, when you live in religious life, this happens a lot. The young men come in and then they get their habit, and as they go along, let me appear to be humble. It also happens among laity. And sometimes, if it's a phase, it's okay. If it persists, you kind of roll your eyes. But all I would say about this giving off the appearance of being humble, these individuals are just unnoticeable enough to attract attention. And I think we all know what that looks like. The person who purposely stands in the back, and just so everybody, we always know who they are. We always know their name. And our attention is attracted, and we call them forth. This is not what Jesus is saying in the gospel, although it sounds that way. If we have to put on a show in any way in order to attract attention to ourselves, we're missing the point. I think of just even here at EWTN, there are people all over the world that know so many of you who sit in this pew day in and day out. And we get letters, and they'll say, I noticed that so-and-so, and they give a description, has not been there. Or one of the brothers says, who is that, this person or that couple, and they're sitting. Now, sometimes there are individuals who have been coming here for several years, and I catch myself saying, I have no idea who that person is. Now it sounds terribly unpastoral, and the friars love to say, oh, Father, shouldn't you at least greet this person? And in time we find out who each of you are, but in this little teeny tiny chapel, some of you are coming here week after week. We see you here and there, and we don't know your name. And this is, in many ways, humility at work. That we're not seeking to be on everybody's radar, and that my name's not at the top of the list, and that Father knows who I am. We all like to go to Cheers, where everybody knows your name. You know, there's a nice place that all of us needs that in our life, but not everybody in the whole world needs to know my name. So this is really, we don't want to pretend humility, and it's easy to pretend humility, and we do that in our pride. But to authentically exercise that virtue. Bear, I'm going to wrap this up quickly out of respect for our producer for the Mass. I know they're having a heart attack in the control room. Their heart rate is pacing. So these are my last points. When we go about our day-to-day life, in religious life or in our family, in our homes, we all know what the tasks are that no one desires to do. If we sit down and put a small list together and say, what's the last thing I would willingly choose to do that needs to be done? If I could leave it up to someone else to do, I would. If I can put myself forward to do that task, that's an opportunity to exercise humility. Because no one else wants to do it, and it's making myself small. The unseen tasks, where I know if I do this, no one's going to say thank you. Everyone just expects it to be done. Or we walk into a room and we see that things are put back in order and we don't have any idea who did it, and we don't announce it at dinner. Oh yes, this afternoon and I was hanging out in the living room, I started but we never invite anybody to praise us or thank us. And another opportunity is to hold our tongue. Many times in conversation, we should contribute to healthy conversation, but sometimes we want to tell a story that highlights me, or that makes sure everyone knows what I've done in my life or who I am. And sometimes in those moments, we want to catch ourselves and ask our Blessed Mother for assistance, to know myself well enough in that moment, and with her grace, to remain silent, to build up my brother or sister, my wife, my husband, my son or daughter, to listen to them through my silence and the denial of myself. May the Lord help us all to exercise this beautiful virtue in imitation of his humility.